go into the third question, Nick, with you. And here we'll be dealing with clauses that pretty much deal with deposits. We've got two clauses of this lease agreement, clause 1.9 and 13.2 of our TPN lease agreements. So they state, the first one states that the deposit must be paid before the lease agreement is valid, right? And the second one then states that, which is 13.2, the tenant will pay the deposit on the signature date, right? So failure to pay the deposit in accordance with the above sections of the lease agreement, which was signed on the 23rd of November, has therefore rendered the lease agreement null and void. The deposit must be paid so that this checkbox obviously was ticked. The landlord returned the signed agreement on Thursday, the 23rd of November, and the tenants were invoiced on the same day to obviously make the payment as per those clauses. So the date now is the 27th of November, according to the agent, and no payment has been received. Nick?
Great. So obviously this deals with our TPN lease agreement. Now, the one thing that's not dealt with in this particular question is whether the tenants have received occupation or not. Okay. So let's just deal with the first clause. The first clause is obviously that it says that the deposit must be paid before the lease agreement becomes valid. Okay. So this is a clause we've added into the TPN lease agreement, which is a safety provision for the landlord in the circumstances. Okay. It's to try and create a circumstance where the landlord ensures that the deposit is paid. Okay. Because every now and then you get a tenant who, they say they're going to pay a deposit. They say they're going to pay their first month's rent. You put them into the property and nothing. Okay. If you look at the TPN data, what's most important when it comes to your tenants, the period in which tenants are going to breach their lease agreements is the first 3 months of a lease agreement. Okay. Generally, if your tenant can get through their first 3 months, and obviously month one generally will include a deposit payment, you should have a tenant that's going to continue to pay their lease agreement. Obviously, this is not guaranteed. There are factors that happen in every person's life, including a tenant's, but that's your risk period, is your first 3 months. Okay. So this is a safety provision to try and make sure that there is some sort of buffer for the landlord to receive a deposit, okay, which is obviously also covers any non-payment by the tenant before the lease agreement comes into place. Okay. So if that's part of the clause, if it's been ticked off, yes, the lease agreement won't come into place if the deposit's not paid, such as in this circumstance, it can be sufficiently argued that the lease agreement actually didn't come into place until such time as that suspensive condition is fulfilled by the tenant in the circumstance. So our writer says that was signed on the 23rd, it's now the 27th, nothing's been paid. Obviously, what you want to do in the circumstances is try push to get that payment in so that that condition is fulfilled. And if it isn't, you can argue that the lease agreement never came into place. Okay. The difficulty with things like this is if a tenant has already taken occupation of the premises, or there have been circumstances that I've experienced where the deposit doesn't end up getting paid, but the rental for some reason does. Okay. Now, what you need to be careful about in circumstances like this is, while the argument can be sustained that the lease agreement wouldn't have come into place because the suspensive condition isn't met, you need to be careful about payment of rental and accepting rental by the landlord, even though that suspensive condition isn't met. Because as we remember in South African law, it is not a requirement for a lease agreement to be in writing. Okay. And a lease agreement can be formed either tacitly or implied, depending on what the conduct of the parties is. So in this particular circumstance, if the tenant hasn't taken occupation of the premises, if they haven't paid their rental amount, and the landlord hasn't accepted payment of a rental amount, it's very easy to argue the condition wasn't met, the lease agreement is clearly not in place, and either the landlord is in a position where he can refuse to give occupation of the premises, or if unluckily he's already given occupation of the premises, he can cancel or not cancel, he can demand that the tenants vacate the premises immediately because the lease agreement actually never came into effect. If there is a circumstance where rental was paid, okay, there can be an argument that a tacit or implied lease agreement has been established in the circumstances. And generally what's going to happen is that tacit lease agreement is going to be on the same terms and conditions as the lease agreement, which was in writing in any event. Okay, because generally what a tenant's going to do is they're going to pay the rental amount, which was stipulated within the lease agreement in any event, and that's going to be the amount that the landlord ultimately elects to accept as a rental payment. So landlords need to be very careful about that. Your conduct can give away that another lease agreement, which is not the same as the written one, but is on the same terms as the written one, is established between the parties. Yeah. So look, I mean, the question here, they're just saying there's no payment before the on the 27th of November. What that means in strict terms is that the lease agreement hasn't come into place yet. So if your tenant hasn't been given occupation at this point, which if I'm assuming that your occupation date is going to be the 1st of December, you are perfectly entitled to say no. You haven't fulfilled the suspensive condition, and therefore the lease agreement is not in place. Alternatively, if they have received occupation at this point, you're in a position to say to them, the lease agreement hasn't actually come into place, and we need you to get out of the premises at this point.
Okay. So yeah, thank you very much, Nick, for that answer. And then that does bring us to the end of today's episode, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be back next week with the team at the same time, same place. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Yes.
Thanks.